My name is Dave Hollenbach, the host of From Embers to Excellence, a podcast that explores the many facets of leadership from the perspectives of some amazing people. We discuss the triumphs and failures that have shaped our lives and our leadership philosophies. I've found that it isn't whether we fail that defines us, but when we do fail, how we respond. Leaders dust off the ashes and use their failures as fuel to work harder and as lessons to come back wiser and stronger, more resilient, more determined, and more committed to excellence. Today I'm speaking with Jerry Fu, who is a conflict resolution coach for Asian American leaders. He started coaching in 2017 to help other Asian American professionals deal with the challenges they encounter at work, with their families, and within themselves. Prior to starting his coaching business, Jerry worked as a pharmacist and began facilitating leadership workshops. Today, Jerry offers a range of coaching services, which includes individual coaching, group workshops, and keynote presentations. To contact him, I'll have his website in the show notes, but it's adaptingleaders.com. And just real quick, let me thank you, Jerry, for coming on the show and allowing me to interview you. We've had a minute to get to know each other, and just reading a little bit about you, I've got a sense of where this conversation is going to go, and I'm pretty excited to dig in. But I just wanted to say thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave. I'm excited to have this conversation with you for sure.
First, I read that you're in Texas. You're in Houston, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, where were you born in Texas?
Wisconsin, actually.
All right.
Yeah.
So you were born and raised in Wisconsin?
For the start of my life, my dad's job took us down to Knoxville, Tennessee, actually, when I started sixth grade. And I finished high school there. And my first taste of Texas was an undergraduate when I came to Houston for college at Rice. And when I decided on pharmacy school as the next step in my life, I moved back up to Tennessee. And then after I graduated, I worked in Tennessee for a little bit before moving back down to Houston.
I see that your focus is primarily Asian American professionals. And I'm guessing because it's probably some cultural differences that you are able to address. Is that?
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about that? And maybe let's start with your life growing up, some of your early influences, and maybe some of those cultural things that are prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So growing up, my parents, did what they could as immigrants just to kind of make a nice life for themselves, right? Just, try to keep your head down, mind your own business. Don't do anything that might antagonize people or upset them, right? If you have to fit in, even if there's things that you're uncomfortable with or disagree with, just put those aside and, you just complain later, basically. And so growing up, this is the model that I saw my parents use a lot when they were hosting friends or company out of town, or just dealing with internal things, right? And there was just this need to placate, basically, that would hold the situation over for a while until enough resentment built up where finally, like, the arguments would come out and the frustration would come out, and then you had to deal with a bigger mess than had you learned to deal with the conflict initially, right? Well, the fire is still relatively small. One example I can give you is when a college friend of mine, when he came to visit over the summer, I asked my mom, hey, we'll call him Gary. Can Gary stay with us for a couple of days and hang out? And she's like, oh yeah, sure. Have a good time. So Gary comes by, and, my mom's a perfectly gracious host. And, after a couple of days, Gary leaves. My mom's like, as soon as he leaves, my mom's like, can you believe Gary? Like, he didn't clean up after himself in the bathroom. Like, he left hair everywhere. He didn't make his bed. right? Because the unwritten or unsaid expectation when you stay at a host's place is that you leave the place as you found it or better, right? But for a lot of people, they're a little more laid back, and like for a lot of us, it probably wouldn't be a big deal. Hey, the host came, or the guest came, that we just clean up after them. But an Asian mindset, like the idea is to be as respectful of other people's property as possible, right? And so that means, yeah. And so on one hand, we have this unsaid expectation that we hopefully he would understand and figure out on his own. But since he didn't, right now we just kind of vent our frustration, hopefully get over it, and then we just make sure we just never invite him back again. And so this is the kind of conflict resolution approach that I saw for myself, that for better or worse, I used in my own interactions to my detriment, right? Same thing happened in retail pharmacy. A patient or a customer would want something unreasonable or inappropriate, and we would try to stand our ground by saying no. And so then they just went above our heads to corporate, complained to corporate, and corporate would say, no, we don't want to deal with it. Just give them what they want because we need their money. And so you just went home and you just hated yourself because you just feel like you were disrespected.
These lessons apply to everybody when it comes to conflict resolution, but what are some of the common mistakes that people make with conflict?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share my own mistakes in the process because I've made them. They're common. The first is avoidance, right? People think that if they create enough distance or they just keep their head down, that somehow the problem will go away on its own. And occasionally a problem might solve itself, but that's the very small exception and not the rule, right? For instance, when I was working on my pharmacy jobs, right, if a technician typed up a prescription incorrectly, right, maybe I give them the benefit of the doubt once. Maybe they say, hey, it was busy. Have them overlook it. I'll just fix it. We'll move on. But then it happens again, right? Now it's my choice whether or not I need to engage them or to just continue to compensate for them, right? And so if I choose to engage, right, maybe we figure out exactly what the problem is. We figure out how to fix it, done. But if I am afraid to upset them, or I'm afraid of dealing with someone who gets defensive, or they push back, and I'm like, well, I don't want to have this argument, so I'm just going to work twice as hard now to compensate for the fact that this technician is making mistakes, right? Now I'm doing two jobs for the price of one. So yeah, that is a common mistake. The second is charging ahead without any real research, right? When people think, okay, I've seen enough evidence to be upset, I'm going to charge in, I'm going to tell the technician why, she's doing wrong, what she needs to do about it, and make sure she doesn't let it happen again. Maybe there was a misunderstanding I wasn't aware of because I didn't check myself and actually assess the territory before I engaged, right? Now I have to apologize for two things. Number one, for getting the story wrong, and number two, hurting someone's feelings, unnecessarily, right? A third mistake is interrupting. When people listen to respond instead of listening to listen, right? People don't like being disrespected. And when you are quick to cut them off, it shows you're not actually paying attention to them or giving them the respect they need as humans to really have a strong relationship. So those are the three common mistakes I do. And then a fourth actually is thinking that conflict is conformance. Like somehow I need to get this other person to conform to my way of thinking and see why they am right. And just trust that they just need to do what I say as a recommendation to solve the problem.
That kind of leads us into some tips that you may have to resolve conflict effectively.
Yeah, let me go over the 5-step framework available as a downloadable free guide on my website. The first step is to imagine what success sounds like, right? Think about, hey, success may or may not be restoring the relationship to 100%. Success may mean finding a truce with someone that you get in arguments with. Success may mean firing that employee that is consistently underperforming. So I need to be clear about what success is, but you just need to imagine, hey, you know what, maybe this conversation could go well, and you allow for that possibility. So yeah, first imagine that, hey, you know what, maybe this could be really great. At the very least, they could receive my feedback well, and then that's the end of it. Second step is to find 10 seconds of courage, because a lot of people think they need to feel like a superhero, right? They need to have the cape and the costume on before they engage. And if you wait until you feel like you're ready, that may be 3 months, that might be 6 months. By then, you've not just avoided the problem, you've lost the company, right? And so 10 seconds of courage, right, just enough to stretch yourself to say, okay, let me pick up the phone, let me send that email, let me, send that text. And so you set things in motion, and then you lock the gate behind you, because if you allow yourself to default to comfort, you're probably going to stay there. So in this case, you don't have to be a hero, right? You just need to just do enough to get started. So that is step 2. Step 3 is to script your critical moves. Let's say someone wants to ask their boss for a raise, right? And they're like, well, I don't know what kind of case I need to make except asking for more money. It's like, okay, well, why don't you take some time to not just let your thoughts rattle around up here, but get them out on paper, right? Make sure you list everything possibly that you might want to say to your boss, right? You also want to anticipate pushback that your boss may give you to say, oh, hey, money's tight, or no, I don't have enough evidence to really justify why I should pay you more money, right? So you want to organize your thoughts. Then you want to, step 4 is to rehearse those moves, right? Practice in front of a mirror. Do you command, confidence? Do you come across as assured? Do you have good posture? Are you scared when you say the number that you're hoping to get, right? Get a friend to role play with you, right? To be that boss that you can go back and forth with, because you want to spar in the dojo before you fight on the street, right? Anyone would tell you to practice. And then step 5 is to do it, right? The cost of not engaging is worse than the cost of trying and failing. But a lot of people forget that, right? Because what happens if I just too scared to ask my boss for a raise? Am I going to trust that maybe next year he'll actually give me one? It's like, you could, but why wait that long? And why be resentful for the entire time up until he, brings up the topic, assuming he ever does, right? And so that was a big tip for me, was recognizing that the cost of avoiding was worse than the cost of trying and failing.
Going back to your childhood and really learning from your environment these cultural norms and really assimilating to the keep your head down, don't make waves, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What are some tips, or what are some things that you would coach your younger self to do or be, or how to act in more or let's say take on more of a leadership role or persona?
Yeah, great question. The first thing I need to realize was it's okay to bring things up gently. Like, if you just ask about something, it's okay. Like John Maxwell, one of my favorite phrases from him is, he says, people don't always do as expected, but they always do as inspected. And so I'll give an example. Like, at one point in college, a friend of mine, I had bought a packet of material for a class, but I decided I wasn't going to use it. And so she asked, well, can I use it? And I said, sure, here you go. And, I paid money for that. And, she never gave me any compensation, right? And I was just so afraid to ask, hey, you know what, that cost me money, could you at least, pay me for it, or half, or something, or compensate me something, right? Because I'm not just going to give this away for free. But I never brought it up with her, right? Because I was just like, well, money's a sensitive topic, and I don't want to upset her or make it sound like I'm trying to like rip her off. And it's like, no, you just need to ask her if she's willing to pay you for something you paid for, right? I think that's a fair thing to do. So that's one thing I would coach my former self on, is just say, hey, you know what, you don't have to be afraid of bringing things up. As long as you do it in a gentle way, you don't have to, it should be fairly well received, right? In the worst case scenario, oh, I shouldn't have to pay you for that, It's like, well, at least I understood why she didn't plan on paying me for it, right? But instead, I just assumed the worst and just said, well, if she doesn't think she should pay me for it, I guess I'm just going to have to settle, right? Another thing I would tell myself is, hey, um, your boss wants results, not stories. Um, you know, basically, I used to think that as long as I had a good enough story as to why I didn't get the job done, that somehow like my boss would be okay with that. And that doesn't work. you know, um, it's kind of like if I would complain about being single and then, I'm just like, oh, like this just isn't fair. And I just keep getting shot down. And people would ask me, I would just tell myself, well, do you want pity or do you want a girlfriend? Right. And this is the kind of thing, right? Businesses like survive because they get results, not because of excuses, right? Excuses don't compensate. But in my younger self and my aversion to failure and my aversion to look incompetent, I would just avoid these things and just give reasons why I shouldn't have to engage them. And it's like, okay, I need to learn from a much younger age that this isn't going to fly, and not like out of shame, but just to say, hey, look, the best thing that you can do is get results. Don't settle for stories. If I had to round it out with the third one, um, I'll tell myself, hey, in the same vein, failure is not fatal, right? Listen, the power of a no is good on both sides. Whether you say no to something, an activity or an opportunity you're just not that interested in, it's okay to say no. You don't have to people please and like think that they want a yes when you really don't want to give them one. And the same thing is also true if someone tells you no. If I ask a girl out, she says no, it's like, it's okay. Thank her for not wasting more of your time, right? That no is the power to move on. So those are some things I would coach myself on if I had the chance to travel back in time.
I'd like to get a sense of your career path. You you went to school, you became a pharmacist, and now you're a coach. So can you kind of walk me through this and maybe lay out some of your experiences that really shaped your leadership philosophy and your coaching style?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the themes that we just went over, I hope it's not hard to pick up on how these played out in my career path. The first is that in college, right, I was actually originally pre-med. I thought I was going to go to med school after I finished college. And then I got a C in organic chemistry. And, in Asian minds, right, they're just like, just don't bother, right? I couldn't deal with the shame of the idea of being rejected from med school. And so I just said, well, okay, I'm just not going to deal with that. But I still want to do healthcare. So what else could I do? And so I said, well, pharmacy seems like a pretty viable alternative. Let me convince pharmacy school that I would make a good pharmacist. And okay, I'm going to go to pharmacy school. And so here, after finishing pharmacy school, I got into, some heated debates with my mom about what kind of job I should take. And there was a chain pharmacy she was a big fan of, that we had a friend who worked for, and she says, hey, you should work for this company, because she didn't want me to deal with some of the career challenges my dad dealt with growing up. My dad ended up getting a total of 2 masters, one in chemical engineering, one in computer science, and still struggled to find consistent work. And so she says, well, I want you to have stability. I don't want you to struggle like he had. So just take this chain pharmacy job. My mom has never worked a day in her life in pharmacy, but moms know best. So, and I was in my own conflict aversion, right? I just didn't feel like dealing with her arguing anymore. So, okay, fine, mom, I'll take this job. Didn't take long for me to regret that decision. But then I got complacent. And when I actually ended up in a situation within the company where I had a lot of flexibility scheduling and I was making good money, I just left it alone, because I was like, well, situations like this are rare. So let me, make the most of this. But once that went away on its own, I moved to a busier store that I didn't have the flexibility that I used to. And I was just like, okay, I'm not happy again. And it took a really bad customer service incident where, I ran out of nice things to say to this lady. And even worse, after I hung up the phone, my partner gives me another earful for not handling it better, even though I knew I did the best I could to, apologize to the patient and try to find a solution. And so this was like 5 years in, and I was like, okay, no, I have to get out of here. I have to find something else. But the problem is, right, I wasn't working on my career at all. I was just happy just to coast working for a chain pharmacy. And so when I wanted to get into teaching pharmacy students, I didn't have a lot of options. But thankfully, my network came through for me, and a friend of mine who worked for a consulting company here in Houston, pharmacy consulting company, said, "Hey, I got promoted. My previous teaching position's still available. Do you want to apply for it?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so I submit my resume. I convinced them that I'm worth taking a chance on. And so next thing I know, I'm moving from Knoxville to Houston for this teaching job. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is a great company. I hope it's the last company I ever have to work for. And, one of my tasks was to help draft test questions. And unfortunately for me, I ran into writer's block a lot sooner than I wanted to. And so somehow I convinced myself that as long as I told my boss as to why I didn't get the job done, that she would be okay with it. And that didn't go well. And so unfortunately for me, right, that just set a very bad precedent for me. And now I lost my boss's trust. In the next couple of months, where I was just playing uphill, trying to earn back the favor that I wasted away, it didn't go well for me. And so after 11 months, the company said, "We've had enough of this. We don't know what's going on with you, but you need to go." And that was hard for me to admit that, I wanted to, blame my unfair boss or other circumstances that just happened to be very unfortunate. But I didn't want to admit that when I looked back at the body of work I gave them, that I would fire me too, right? So that was hard. And so the next 6 weeks, I'm just like, well, I can't move back to Knoxville. They filled my previous position already. So I had to figure out a way in Houston to survive. And unfortunately for me, me being naive about, some of the shady people out there, I ended up at an independent pharmacy where I was filling for crooked doctors and 4 of my paychecks bounced. So I was jeopardizing my license and I wasn't even getting paid for it. And even worse, I'm still conflict averse. So I'm upset with my boss, but I don't know how to confront him, right? And a side note, right? I was mailing my checks home because I didn't have a local bank account. I'd never bothered setting one up. And so when the first check bounced, my boss initially called me and apologized. He's like, "Hey, there was a glitch or some kind of thing. We'll take care of it." I was just like, "Okay, good." One time, yeah, weird stuff happens, fine. But then 2, 3, and 4 bounce. But I'm mailing these checks home and I don't know about it until after, he tells me, "Oh, hey, yeah, other problems." And then I call my mom and I'm like, "Mom, did you know about this?" And she goes, "Yeah, but I was just too afraid to tell you." It's like, Mom, like, this is not news that you should avoid telling me, right? You can't just avoid telling me bad news because it's bad. Like, this is bad news I need to act on, right? And so, again, this theme of conflict aversion, just very unhealthy, right? And so anyway, thankfully, after enough problems, my friends got me out of that situation, got me on with another company that was more legitimate. But money was really tight. They said, "Hey, we can't pay you more than 8 hours a week." I was like, "Okay, now what do I do?" They said, "Well, if you're willing to work out in Austin, which is 2.5 hours away, you can get more hours." And so I said, okay, I could end up in worse places, but I have no idea what life is going to look like at this point. So this is 2012 now. And so that summer, some friends of mine who run a pharmacy leadership nonprofit said, "Hey, one of our facilitators had to back out for our national meeting. Would you be interested in stepping in?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so for a while, right, leadership was just something I wasn't good at. And I had failed enough to feel like I would never be good at it. And so I just avoided it. But now, after teaching leadership, something kind of unlocked in my head. And I said, well, what if I could be a good leader, right? What would that take? What kind of work would that involve? How would I carry myself? And yeah, a key person, as you I'm sure want to ask about, is a pharmacist named Michael Negretti. And when I co-facilitated with him, I saw how he brought out the best in me. I saw how I was motivated to work really hard for him and come through for him. And I said, wow, how did he do that? And so I studied his style. I slowed down and I studied the blueprint. I said, wow, Michael is fun to be around. He's always approachable. I like that. Number two, Michael is fun to learn from. He's always reading something interesting. And so I want to hear about what he's learning about. So now I want to learn too. Number three, Michael works hard. Man, there's no question about if he has to stay up late to get a task done or spend extra time. or spend extra resources, it's no problem. There's no question how hard he works and sets a good tone. Number 4, he's always creating, he's always adjusting, he's always he's always like tinkering and experimenting, and he's like, hey, I switched this around, and then he collaborates and invites me to collaborate with him. Hey, I made these changes. What do you think of them? So now I'm much more engaged because he's like, hey, your input is valuable. I need your help with this, right? And so this is the blueprint that I follow and internalize when I realize I need to become a better leader. And so I put my own spin on things. I certainly don't want to just be a Michael Negretti clone, but even if I were, it's still a really effective leadership style. So these are some of the things that I took on. But back to the career path, right? So later that fall, I had the chance to either stay part-time in Austin or take on a full-time manager position that had opened up in Houston. And so I said, okay, I can't stay scared. I'm ready to come home. I'm going to take on this challenge of being a manager. I proceed to get written up the following year because my technicians are not pulling their weight and I'm just refusing to write them up or fire them. And so management says, this is a problem, they're a problem, and your passivity is a problem. And I was like, okay, that really hurts, but it's true. I need to do something about that. And so thankfully, I managed to push one technician out the door just out of sheer luck. And then shortly after that, the company had their funding pulled. And so I said, well, what do I do? And so thankfully, I randomly got another job opportunity to interview for. And the only reason they even agreed to interview me was that I had leadership experience on my resume now. And so that's why I say that leadership saved my career, because, it gave me job options that wouldn't have had otherwise. And that being said, the job options still didn't last very long. Smaller companies that offer a higher quality of life get stamped out pretty ruthlessly by, big chain pharmacy and insurance companies. And so 4 years ago, when my previous employer went under, I said, well, I'm tired of chasing scripts. I'm tired of fighting insurance companies that dictate how much I can make. But I love teaching the leadership workshops, which I've done consistently since 2012. What if I tried to make a career in coaching? What would that look like? Still very scared of failure and rejection. So this was more of a hobby for me at that point when I first declared myself a coach. And I tell people, Dave, it took a pandemic for me to say, what am I waiting for? How much longer can I put this off? So last October, I filed the LLC, got the website up, and here we go.
So now that you're off on your own, coaching leadership, coaching conflict resolution.
Yeah.
What are some questions that you ask yourself so that you remain self-aware and are performing at your highest level to deliver to your clients?
Yeah, great question. The first question to ask is, what is my hesitation costing me? When I'm afraid that a client's going to say no or ignore an email, right? Like it's that classic basketball analogy. You make 0% of the shots you don't take, right? And I have to remind myself of that daily. Hey, that is the first question. Say, hey, what is my fear of rejection costing me as well? Another is, what's the most important thing I can do today? Is it creating content? Is it doing market research? Is it networking with other podcast hosts? What is the most important thing I need to take care of today? And so, because there are times I'll get trapped in the urgent, right? And I just want to feel good about getting something done. So I do the most immediate thing, even though it's not the most important thing. And sometimes, there's some merit to that, but at the end of the day, right, it's still procrastinating. Like if you're not taking care of the most important thing, it's procrastinating. Other things I ask myself, what can I delegate, right? What are some tasks that are maybe smaller that I can outsource to other people? Other things, what do I need to say no to, right? Too often, I will settle for distractions just because, my energy level is not up to par, or, I just don't feel like working. And so those are some things I like to ask myself in order to keep on track. And then, finally, if I'm in a coaching session or doing a workshop, right? What do I ask myself? How do I really add value to my client? Right? What are they really looking for? What is the best help I can give them? And I can have an idea, and I need to trust that they're going to be honest with me in case my guess doesn't line up with what they actually need. And that's okay. The most important thing is that we're willing to listen and adjust accordingly so that the relationship stays strong.
What was your primary reason for focusing your coaching business toward Asian Americans?
Yeah, great question. So to zoom out for a second, we talk in coaching, we talk about niching. And so the coach who says, oh, yeah, I can help everybody, big deal, right? Nothing special about that. So in niching down, we have to ask ourselves, well, who is your ideal client, right? Who would you love to work with? And a common clue is to ask yourself who you were 10 years ago. And so in the same way, I know I struggle with cultural upbringing, and what was said to me about how to handle conflict is the same conflict that I know other Asian Americans in their mid 20s and early 30s are also dealing with. And so that is why, I specifically wanted to focus, number one, on Asian American leaders, because I know they're having similar challenges as to what I went through going down this path. And then also specific to that skill set of conflict resolution, because our tendency is to avoid the difficult, and we'd rather just hope that things go away on their own. And so that is my reason for niching down. Number one, from a business decision, but also number two, just from a passion point of view, where it's just like, hey, here are the people I'm most excited to help.
One of the things that we kind of skirted over, we touched on it prior to beginning the interview, but what fits right in to the overall theme of this show, from embers to excellence, is when you lost your job and you had these experiences that, I mean, like, I've experienced it myself, where you're just like, shit, what do I do now? Like, I've just lost this path that I laid out for myself. Like, it's not even there anymore. So what do I do now? And for a lot of individuals, whether it's leaders or people that never saw themselves as leaders, they find themselves at a crossroads. They are either willing to accept their fate and accept the doom and gloom and just dissolve into the abyss, or they take what they've learned, they take this experience, this negative energy that has been consuming them, and they use that energy to blaze a new path. And and really, it may not take you to a different end result, but it takes you on a different path to achieve your ultimate purpose, and maybe it's a path that helps you really realize your ultimate purpose that maybe you ignored your entire life, who knows. But in this experience of yours, can we maybe get down, like, not just a high, like, bird's eye view of your experience, but dig in a little bit, and maybe some of the things that really energized you to go, that's enough of the pity party, let's get this show going.
Yeah, great questions. You know, I think of a Lewis Howes quote where he says, "You're only as strong as your adversity makes you." That's one thing that comes to mind. And I didn't want to admit that that was true. Um, Leadership was a huge struggle for me. And the irony is that the more I struggled with it, the more fascinated I became with it. Right. seeing it modeled for me well also kind of inspired me to say, hey, you know what? I want to do that too. And so, yeah, basically, right, uh, putting yourself in, reasonable challenges, whether calculated or not, is really the kind of the best way to make yourself grow up. And I'll give an example just so we're not just talking in vague terms. One challenge that really shaped me was when I served as a church class director at one point. And my second day on the job, I found out that a newer guy in the class was sexually harassing women in the class. And the woman that came to me with their concerns said, hey, you got to deal with this. You're director. It's like, frick, you didn't give me a manual. Just run toward the gunfire. You just got to handle it. Fall on this grenade. It's like, frick, I didn't even know. And so, I happened to be going on vacation the next day. So I couldn't even, get this guy face to face. I had to get, pick up the phone and, reach out to this guy and discuss this very heavy topic with him, this very, serious allegation, and try to figure out exactly how he's going to respond. So we'll call him Nick. So I call up Nick, I'm like, hey, Nick, so these women say you're sexually harassing them. Like, what's going on? Because I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what they're talking about. I would never do something like that, blah, blah, blah. Right. And so I had to tell him, I was like, well, Nick, look, I could have just said, well, hey, as long as this is on the table, you just got to leave. Like, I could have done that because I had that right as director. But I think the healthier approach is what ended up playing out, right? I had no manual. All I knew is I knew enough to set it in motion, just trust that I was just going to improvise my way to the finish line, right? And so, when I told him, I said, hey, look, Nick, there's three possibilities here. One, you are correct and they are lying. And, it's not for me to say who's right because I wasn't there. But if you are right about your innocence and they are, ultimately just criticizing you, it sounds like it's a misunderstanding. Just go clear it up, figure out exactly what you're doing that's bothering them. Just don't do it anymore. That's it, right? It could be that simple. Possibility number two, they are right and you are wrong, which means you're lying. And also you're doing inappropriate things, which means that if you expect to stay part in their class, go to them, apologize, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And we'll be watching you very closely from here on out. Number three is that you insist you're right, they insist they're right, which means now it's their word against yours. And I have to ask you to leave because I've known them longer than I've known you. So of these three choices, Nick, which one, do you want to go with? Because it sounds like I need to go talk to them and get things sorted out. Okay, just do it by this Saturday and we'll see what happens. Unfortunately, for him, it turns out number two was correct and we never saw him again. But, moments like this, right? It forced me to grow. I'll tell people I didn't want to be director. Like, that wasn't anything I was necessarily looking forward to, but the situation came down to, well, hey, Jerry, no one else is qualified, no one else is motivated. Please step in to fill this need. And, take it for what it is, right? I think a lot of the best leaders are ones that don't look for the title. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I'd say, yeah, that is one instance that really shaped my approach to conflict resolution.
One thing that you just said makes me wonder,
Yeah.
what do you view as one of the most powerful qualities a leader can have?
Good question. If I had to choose one, my favorite word for leadership is integrity. And what I mean by that, because I don't want that to just sound like, vague corporate speak. Integrity means being clear about who you are, that, that there's consistency in your identity and what you say and what you do. So people have no question as to whether or not they can trust you. Do you honor promises, right? When you make a promise to you, do your best to keep it. And even if you fail, do you still find a way to renegotiate? Do you, have compassion for the people? Do you have integrity in your relationships? Like, are they strong? And so, yeah, I think the most important thing is integrity, saying, hey, I know exactly who Jerry is and I know I can trust him.
So I did this exercise with my daughter where we we basically came up with our mantra or motto,
Mhm.
and we went through all of these qualities and characteristics that we would use to describe somebody that we without a doubt would follow
Mhm.
and would want to emulate.
Yeah.
And one of those one of those characteristics, one of those traits was integrity.
Mhm.
And the exercise goes like this. You write down all of these qualities, and
Yeah.
then without fail you're going to find some that overlap in their meaning, and you group those all together,
Yeah.
and then you find the most powerful descriptor
Mhm.
essentially and get it down to about 3 or 4,
Yeah.
and then you define each one of those descriptors
Good.
and how that really what those mean to you.
Mhm.
And so those are your core values.
Good.
And then you write a leadership statement around those.
Nice.
What we came up with was wisdom. Before taking action, know what you have control over and what you have zero control over.
Good.
Morality,
Mm.
being empathetic, compassionate, and ethical in your actions.
Mm.
And that was so a lot of this really falls under integrity.
Mhm.
And the third is fortitude,
Mm.
perseverance in the face
Good.
of adversity,
Good.
being courageous when it is easier and less painful to succumb to your fears.
Good.
Moderation, tempering your words and behavior through
Mm.
self-control. Now, we use these to write our mantra, and our
Yeah.
mantra is leadership through virtue and action.
Okay.
And what I've done is I've actually made that as the motto, the part of my logo. However, I translated it into Latin to give it
Mhm.
some flair, So it's ductu per virtutem et actionem,
Wow.
leadership through virtue and action. And it's wisdom, morality, fortitude, and moderation.
Nice.
And in that integrity component, I can give you some of my own personal experiences with integrity because
Mhm.
I've made some really bad decisions in my past that do not reflect my values.
Fair enough.
And it really brought into question my integrity, something that I value.
Mm.
And as a leader, and as a leader that had earned a lot of respect
Mm.
from not just my peers, but the people above me and the people that I led. When my integrity came into question,
Mhm.
that was soul crushing. So, as a coach, as a leadership coach,
Mhm.
because I know that I'm not the only one that's ever gone through that existential crisis right there.
Mhm.
How would you coach somebody through that?
Through some kind of like failure in that regard.
Right. The
Okay.
that overcoming that failure and integrity.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
how do you rebuild that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, you know, I'll share a moment that I had with Mike when I was recapping when I got fired, right? Because that technically was a break in integrity for me. And I thought about all the struggles that I had to, fight for gainful employment after that. And I remember telling him, this was like 7 years ago. It's like getting fired had to be one of the worst things that ever happened to me. And Mike goes, pauses for a second. He goes, because you look at it as the best thing that's ever happened to you. And it just kind of judo flipped the situation on me. And I said, you know what? I guess I have to. What do I tell people now? Getting fired was the wake up call I needed to really set me on this path of self improvement and realizing, hey, whatever you're doing, it's not working for you. Right. So, it's tough. You don't want to condone anything that's a really bad moral failure, right? Like I know at least one youth pastor that had to step down because of an affair. Like it's just ugly, right? But the blessing and the silver lining in that is that that's the wake up call you need, right? And I wouldn't try to state this case to the client. I would just ask them, what if this was the best thing that ever happened to you? And just kind of let that sit and see if they're willing to fill in their own evidence to make that question or that posture true. Because they don't have to. They could say, no, I don't see how this could be the best thing that ever happened to me. But for my side commentary, honestly, when you have a moment where expectations get reset and you have no choice to go anywhere but up, what if that's the best thing to happen to you?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
very
no,
freeing. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. What you just said um is right on the money. I I found myself really going, man, I'm not who I thought I was, and
Mhm.
you start questioning like, gosh, I'm a fraud, I'm this, I'm
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that people make mistakes.
Yeah.
People have lapses in judgment for whatever reason. And if that is a true flaw in your character, it's going to be represented in more than just one instance,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
And if it's not represented in more than just one instance, then you can look at it as, man, this was a huge opportunity for me
Hmm.
to learn, like, holy crap, I've got
Hmm.
to be a lot more careful with
Hmm.
my decisions, with my behaviors, and
Yeah.
really be more disciplined. Socrates said, the way to gain a good reputation is to endeavor to be what you desire to appear. Endeavor to be what you desire to appear,
Okay.
because you can spend your entire life building this impeccable reputation,
Hmm.
but in an instant you can lose it.
Yeah.
So to overcome that loss of reputation, well, that's not the end of the world.
Hmm.
It's just a reset.
Yeah.
And so like I feel like at this point in our conversation, we're possibly speaking to those people that are, that have struggled with that, or maybe they're coaching somebody that
Hmm.
is experiencing that
Hmm.
existential crisis where,
Yeah.
they made a mistake and they're like really down on themselves. Well,
Hmm.
what you said, can you flip it
Hmm.
and make it, frame it as, is this the best thing that could have happened to you?
Yeah.
Because now you can go on to do bigger and better things.
Yeah. And this isn't, I don't want people to think, oh, we're just being cheesy and saying, well, you can always look on the bright side of life. It's like, no, this sucks. Like, it hurts,
Yeah.
and I mean, same thing, another situation I had to deal with was at one point I had to evict a roommate, right? He defaulted on his lease and basically hid in his room and banked on the idea that I was too nice to actually follow through with evicting him until, I got tired of dealing with it. And I told him, yeah, you got to leave before I call the cops. Like, I've given you more than enough extensions. You've not shown me anything, any return, on the grace I've given you. If you're not going to contribute to living costs here, you need to leave. And when he realized he couldn't keep giving me vague promises about how soon he'd have the money, he finally moved out. And, shortly after he moved out, he actually ended up getting a job. And, so I'm not here to dance on his grave and be like, hi, I showed him. I was sad that I even had to go through with this process, right? It's like when a parent disciplines their kids, you're just like, I hate to have to do this to you, but I know the cost of not disciplining you, right? And the fact that he realized, hey, maybe hitting rock bottom was the wake up call to say, okay, I can't just, bank on Jerry's you know, generosity anymore. I need to actually man up and get a job. I'd like to think that somehow this is a catalyst.
One thing that I'm curious about,
Yeah.
when you're coaching other Asian Americans, what would you consider to be a common theme that you work with them
Hmm.
on developing?
Yeah, great question. In the conversations I've had with Asian clients, I think it's just learning to take that initiative, um, to speak up on things that you want to address, like that somehow to realize that that's not selfish or diva-ish to bring up certain things. One client I had, he was afraid that he was going to lose his job in the next round of cuts, right, during a really tough economy. And so, we talked through, well, what's something you can do to keep this from happening. And he came up with the idea to, set aside time with his boss and talk about, hey, boss, what skills would you recommend I acquire so that I can stay employed with the company, right? Like, you don't have to like wait for crap to hit the fan before you have to do anything. But you can be more proactive with that. Same thing with another client. She dealt with a passive aggressive boss, very temperamental. He tried to call her off the clock. She ignored his call because she was like, I'm not working right now. He blew up at her the next day. Why didn't you answer my phone call? I don't think you're that committed to this place. And she comes to me. She's like, Jerry, I don't know how to handle my frustration without possibly losing my job if I antagonize him further. How do I handle this conversation? Right. So yeah, just be more proactive when crap's going to go down. Hey, let's put you in a position to do something productive about it.
We've covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel we should touch on?
I'll share one story I haven't shared in a while, just to, number one, just kind of give an exclusive for you, and also just to, I think, a unique learning moment, for anyone who may not be familiar with, my background or situation. So in high school, at one point after school, some friends and I were playing hacky sack, and a lot of teachers weren't a fan of it, and so during school they would confiscate them, but after school it shouldn't matter. But two older white women approached me while we were playing, and with the idea that they were going to compensate, or not compensate, confiscate my hacky sack. And we said, hey, look, we don't know why this is the problem. It's after school, we can do what we want, right? We're not causing any distractions. And I happened to be wearing a t-shirt with some Japanese sumo wrestler artwork. And for those of you familiar with sumo wrestler garb, there isn't a lot there. It basically looks like a diaper, and so one of the teachers looks at the shirt, like pulls it and shows the other teacher, can you believe he would wear something like this, like, to school? And I'm like, I don't understand how this is in violation of the dress code. It's an ancient Japanese tradition. And the other teacher goes, well, turn your ancient Japanese tradition inside out. And they both laugh and walk away. What do you do in a situation like that, right? How is this okay, right? Who am I to say anything? I'm a freshman. in high school is our, there's no diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops, right? This is like, mid 90s. So part of my chip on my shoulder, you could say, is to give other Asians the courage so that when things like this happen, they don't have to just sit idly by and just say, well, I guess I'm just going to have to forgive them and hope that I get over it. You can still forgive them. That's still, forgiveness is not about whether or not someone deserves it. And in forgiving them, you can still say, hey, I'm not going to condone this. There's something better. There's a better standard for all of us to aspire to.
It's a great story. And there are, and this is something that, as a white male, I've realized that I'm kind of clueless to a lot of the prejudice that other groups have to endure.
Mhm.
One, I mean, I know that what is more prominent in the United States that's really kind of
Mhm.
more in the media is the prejudice towards African Americans
Mhm.
or towards Middle Easterners.
Mhm.
Not a lot is spoken of, at least in the Southeast,
Mhm.
about prejudice towards Asian Americans.
Yeah.
Um, would you attribute that to the culture as being like more like just keep your head down, let's not make any waves?
That's part of it. Yeah. I mean, because, right, all these immigrants, right, they're just like, hey, we're really not trying to tread on anybody. And if we deal with injustices, okay, we're just going to internalize them. And yeah, I mean, that's why there's so many great books written on the topic, the invisible minority, the model minority, it's all there, right? And even worse, people leverage our cultural profile against us, right? And say, y'all are just complaining. Look at these Asians, they're so well behaved, and it doesn't matter what they deal with, they never complain. And it's like, but Asians are dying, right? Like there are hate crimes that were well publicized, and hate crimes during the last 4 or 5 years. Even it's like people blaming Chinese for the coronavirus, right? um One thing I tell people, I learned this the hard way. Houston's Chinatown is built on discrimination. At one point, all the politicians said, we don't want you all kind here. We're going to put you in the southwest part of the city. And even worse, they actually divide the district up in such a way there's no political vote for that district. They said, okay, we got to put them in this part of the city and make sure they have no political leverage. Right. And so, um, yeah, it's just an ugly situation because on one hand, yeah, you read about how China wants to be the next US. They want to be the next world power. And so people are, scared that China's going to overtake the US in some form or fashion. But that doesn't apply to every Asian. And so on one hand, there is a real threat because the US in some ways has gotten complacent in how great we are. And we've done a lot of good things. There's a reason why immigrants come here, because they want a better life for themselves that they couldn't offer themselves otherwise, staying where they were. And it's just a complicated relationship, right? When people say, well, my immigrants, it's okay for us to find a better life here, but as soon as other people also want a better life here, but they're taking away from us, then that's a problem. We need to shut them out. It's like, okay, maybe we revisit that and figure out exactly how to have a better solution where we can lift everybody up, with move from a scarcity mindset right to an abundance mindset to say, hey, you know what, if we're willing to trust that, yeah, resources can be finite, but if there's a way that we can be more willing to be generous with each other, maybe there's a way for that we can all be seen, heard, and respected.
What you just said makes me think of something that is, I think, one of the main
Hmm.
of tenets of
Yeah,
leadership,
yeah.
and that is the purpose or
Mhm.
the main obligation
Yeah.
that a leader takes upon themselves when they assume that role, when they accept that responsibility, they're obligating themselves to really ensuring the success of those people that they're leading.
Good.
And on a much bigger picture, what I've found throughout, and I've said this on a bunch of different episodes, a bunch of different interviews,
Yeah.
throughout history,
hmm
whether it's Eastern philosophy, Greek philosophy, the
hmm
Middle Eastern philosophies, Western philosophy, whatever. Like you
hmm
can look at all the religions, but
Yeah.
throughout them all, there's a common thread
Mhm.
that each one of us is responsible for adding value to those around us.
Good.
It's not about us
hmm
as an individual, it's about the group. And
Good.
if we as leaders can really embrace that and lead others to that realization
hmm
that cutting people out of the equation is not the way.
hmm
I just, I don't know if I stated that clearly. I mean, does it make sense to you?
It made sense to me. Yeah. We want this idea of the self-made man, right? Like, oh, he worked hard and he persevered, and it's like, well, there is a role of individual effort for sure, and to deny all the resources and help that came before you to kind of lift you up to that point, right, is to be ungrateful, right? Isaac Newton said, if I've been able to see further than any other man, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants, right? As much as I get frustrated with my parents for some of the conflict in what they define as success and the deferred life plan, and you know the reason to get married and have kids, and how we define stability, right? I wouldn't be here without their help. They took a chance by coming over from Taiwan in an effort to have a better life for themselves, right? And in the process, you know poured tons of resources into me to be sure I could become a responsible adult. And not just them, there are friends along the way that were generous, other coaches that were kind enough to share their resources, right? And so we have this collective where we realize, hey, yeah, for me to simply ask you to be on your podcast to elevate my platform is foolish and unprofessional and selfish, right? But for me to completely give up my own things just so other people can sacrifice at my expense, it doesn't have to be that way, right? It's a shared benefit. And we're both hopefully better off for having this conversation, everyone listening to this conversation. Um, yeah, on one hand, yeah, parents give, right? Like sacrifice because you're not worried about getting anything back. But what if there is a way to for what if there is a shared benefit for both of you? My mom, was actually very honest. I haven't said this out loud until now. She made it clear that she had kids because, who else is going to take care of her in old age? And she wants me to have kids because that's the extreme long game. Hey, like the only way you're going to have anyone that's really going to look out for you is if you have blood ties and, cultural obligation standards that hold them to say, hey, you owe your parents, right? And, that's not healthy either. But all that to say, you're right. There is a collective there to say, hey, this isn't just for me, it's for the people around me. If I have a circle of influence, let me be faithful to it.
Well, I have a term for it
Yeah,
called it's called selfish altruism.
there you go.
So, and the idea behind it is
Mhm.
in order for you to be of benefit to the people that you're leading, you
Yeah,
have to work very hard
Mhm.
at adding as much value to yourself as
Yeah,
possible so
true.
that you can turn around and add that value to your team.
Good.
The more value that you add to your team, the more high performing your team is.
Yes.
the more high performing your team is, the more everybody benefits, including yourself. And you operate in this fashion where it is your responsibility
Mhm.
to help elevate your team.
Yeah.
And if each person on that team has that same obligation, that same sense of responsibility, it's an incredible thing to
Mhm.
be on one of those teams.
Yeah.
But as it takes at least one person to say, this is how this team is going to operate.
Mhm.
And it's extremely effective, but it's a mindset that has to be developed.
Mhm.
But it's an awesome thing. And if
Mhm.
it could be applied on a much grander scale, what a great place this world would be.
Mhm. Absolutely. Everybody wins.
Jerry, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, allowing me to have this conversation with you.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, I'll have a link to your website in the show notes. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, employ you for your coaching services, or to have you
Mhm.
come speak,
Yeah.
that's the best way to get in touch with you, correct?
Yeah. Just check out www.adaptingleaders.com. You can get that free guide to download if you need a framework to handle hard conversations. So you can schedule a complimentary 30-minute call, talk to me about your situation that you need help with, or just check out the blog where I summarize useful, interesting leadership books. So whatever you do, check out the website. That's where all the goodies are.
Awesome. Oh, I almost forgot. 3 books that you would recommend.
Yeah, yeah. Um, some I need to pick from, but if I had to pick 3 now, number 1, Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath. They give you a framework how to compensate for the blind spots and biases that we tend to fall into as humans. Number 2, I would say The Coaching Habit by Michael Buggy Stanier. 7 questions that every coach or any leader really should use in their leadership style to help have them have to say less and really grow their team. And then 3, Atomic Habits, James Clear. That's a fun one, just to say, hey, how do I make good habits more appealing and bad habits disappear? How do I do that on a micro level? And I think anyone would benefit from these for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you for listening to this episode of From Embers to Excellence. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on your favorite podcast platform and visit hollenbachleadership.com for additional content. My goal is and always will be to add value to as many people as possible. So if I can be of any assistance to you or someone you know, please connect with me via email or on one of my social media accounts, linked on the homepage of my website. Remember, our failures don't define us unless we let them, and the only true measure of a leader is the success of their team.